The night hung heavy over the plantation, thick and silent, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The wind whispered through the tall sugarcane fields, bending the stalks like green waves in the dark. From somewhere deep in the distance, a whip cracked sharply, a sudden sound that echoed across the land like a clap of thunder. The trees shivered in response, and the animals in the fields froze, listening. Even the moon seemed dim behind the slow-moving clouds. Inside the mansion, a woman moved through the candlelit hallways with quiet precision. Her lace gown rustled softly with each step, the delicate fabric brushing against polished wooden floors that gleamed like spilled gold. Her hands trembled just enough to make the pearls around her neck shift, but her eyes remained sharp, piercing the dim light with the authority of a ruler accustomed to command. To the townsfolk, she was simply Miss Clarabelle, a charitable widow of grace and dignity. But among whispers carried through the shadows, she was called something far darker, the Granny of Shadows. The house was a monument to wealth, and yet that wealth was a mask. Chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, scattering light over velvet curtains and mirrors, making the rooms glitter with a fragile elegance. Every surface gleamed, every corner polished, but hidden behind the grandeur were rooms that no visitor ever entered. These spaces held a different kind of history, a faint smell of smoke, sweat, and something else, something heavy, almost like fear itself. Only those who served the house knew the truth of what went on behind the locked doors. Clarabelle paused in front of one of the old mirrors in a hallway lined with portraits of her ancestors. The glass was cloudy with age, but her reflection was clear enough. Her face was lined, her hair silver and pinned neatly atop her head, but her eyes held the sharpness of someone who had learned early how to measure and command. She adjusted the pearls around her neck, then smoothed the folds of her gown. Time had taken her youth, but not her sense of control. In fact, with the passing of years, her authority had grown, unchallenged by anyone in the house. From the outside, the plantation looked serene, almost beautiful under the pale moonlight. But inside, every shadow seemed alive, carrying secrets that could never be spoken aloud. Clarabelle's authority extended beyond commands or chores. It was an invisible presence that could unsettle a man with just a look, a pause, or a faint smile. The enslaved men who served her were watched not merely for their labor, but for something far more intimate. They were measured, appraised, and scrutinized, their very movements becoming instruments of her control. A soft footstep echoed down the hallway. Clarabelle turned, her eyes catching the faint candlelight as a young man appeared at the doorway. He carried a tray with wine, his hand steady, but his eyes lowered. To look at her directly would invite her scrutiny, and that scrutiny was a punishment in itself. He knew better than to raise his head, and he knew that hesitation or a misstep could mark him forever in her gaze. Clarabelle's smile was faint, almost imperceptible, and yet it carried a weight no one else could feel. Not a smile of kindness, but a smile of recognition. She could see everything, the nervous twitch of his fingers, the small tremor in his posture, the very thought of defiance in his mind. Power did not need to be shouted in this house. It moved quietly, shaping everyone who lived within its walls. Clarabelle walked down the hallway slowly, listening to the soft rustle of silk and the faint creak of floorboards. The air seemed thicker here, heavier, as though it remembered every command, every whispered order, every fearful glance. Even the walls seemed to hold memory, reflecting the authority she wielded with invisible hands. The young man followed silently, carrying the tray as if he were part of the furniture, a presence shaped entirely by her gaze. The candlelight flickered, and Clarabelle paused to glance back at him. He flinched. Just a shift of her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement, was enough to remind him who held the power. No lash, no chains were necessary. She had learned long ago that fear and observation were stronger than any whip. The house itself had become her instrument, every shadow, every creak in the wood, a participant in her quiet dominion. From the front windows, the moonlight spilled across the manicured gardens, revealing statues and fountains polished to shine. But no beauty in the world could hide the truths held within the house. Here, in these rooms, men had learned that submission was more than physical. It was psychological, a lesson drilled into them day after day. Those who lived under her gaze learned to move, speak, and even breathe according to her silent commands. Clarabelle reached a set of double doors that led to one of the private chambers. She paused, her hand resting lightly on the handle, as if listening for the presence of unseen witnesses. The young man carried the tray inside and waited at the edge of the room, barely daring to breathe. In that moment, the room held its own consciousness, aware of the fear and control it had nurtured over years. She spoke softly, almost to herself, but loud enough for him to hear. "You may stay, but do not look." The words carried the weight of law, and in that moment he understood perfectly. It was not a request, it was a command, a lesson, and a warning, all at once. And as the door closed behind her, the young man remained frozen, the candlelight casting long shadows across the floor, as though the house itself was watching, waiting, and remembering. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying whispers through the sugarcane. The plantation slept under the moon, silent and still, but inside, power moved like a living thing, unseen and unstoppable. Clarabelle, the granny of shadows, had learned long ago that the most terrifying form of control was not the lash or the chains. It was the quiet dominion over another person's mind and body, wielded invisibly and reinforced every day. And in the silence, the men who served her carried the weight of it in their hearts. They had learned that in this house some things could not be named, some rules could not be broken, and some fears were born not of what one could see, but of what one could feel in the presence of a woman who held power like a shadow over all. Tonight, the plantation breathed slowly, heavy with history and secrets. And at the center of it all, in the heart of the house, Clarabelle remained awake, watching, waiting, measuring. The Granny of Shadows had not yet spoken her last command. The sun rose slowly over the plantation, spilling a pale gold light across the endless rows of sugarcane. The air was heavy, sweet with the scent of the fields, but there was also a sharp edge to it, the faint, ever-present reminder of who owned the land and who worked it. Samuel, a young man of 16, moved quietly through the morning mist, carrying a basket of firewood from the forest. His steps were careful, measured, as if each movement were being watched, because it was. Every day, Samuel felt the weight of the house pressing down on him. Not the weight of bricks or wood, but something heavier, harder to see. The constant, unyielding gaze of Miss Clarabelle. Even when she was not in the room, he could feel it. Her eyes had a way of finding you, judging you, shaping your thoughts without a word spoken. It was a power that chained the mind long before it ever touched the body. He paused by the edge of the fields to catch his breath, wiping sweat from his brow. The sugarcane towered over him, the stalks whispering in the wind. From here, he could see the mansion, grand and gleaming in the sunlight. The towers of the house rose like watchful eyes, and Samuel shivered. He had learned early that the house itself was alive with control, that every creaking floorboard and rustling curtain carried the memory of orders, punishments, and silent lessons. Samuel remembered the first time he had been summoned to the private rooms. He had been just a boy, unaware of the true nature of the house. Clarabelle had called him in quietly, a simple voice, polite and sweet. But the room had felt like a trap. She had measured him with her eyes, instructing him to stand still, to obey, to endure without speaking. Samuel had trembled under her gaze, and the fear had lodged deep in his chest. It had stayed there ever since. Now, years later, he had learned to move with care, to speak with caution, to carry himself in silence. The other men whispered about their own experiences, though never loudly. Fear was a shared language, one that did not need words. They knew what would happen if Clarabelle's attention turned on them, and how impossible it was to hide from it. By midday, Samuel had finished stacking the wood and returned to the house carrying buckets of water for the kitchen. The women in the house bustled around, setting tables and preparing food, speaking softly among themselves. To anyone else, it looked like an ordinary household, a simple life of servants and masters. But Samuel knew the truth. The ordinary was a mask. The everyday work of the house, the chores and the meals, all existed alongside something darker, a quiet ceremony of observation, control, and fear. In the hall, he found Clarabelle seated in her favorite chair, a book open on her lap, but her eyes fixed sharply on him. He froze, bowing slightly, as he always did. The book could have been closed, it could have been anything, but her gaze was alive, aware, searching for the smallest hesitation, the slightest falter. Samuel felt the heat rise in his chest, and he lowered his eyes further. One wrong move here, one flicker of defiance, and it would not just be a scolding. The punishment was psychological, invisible, but it left a mark that lingered longer than any whip ever could. "Bring the towels," she said, her voice soft but firm. No one else was present, yet the command carried the weight of law. Samuel obeyed, moving quickly, his heart hammering. The air in the room seemed to tighten around him, pressing at his chest, whispering reminders of all the other times he had been called, all the times he had been measured, all the times he had been reminded that he was not free. After he placed the towels, Clarabelle studied him quietly. Not a word, just a tilt of her head, the faintest raise of an eyebrow. It pierced through him, cutting away confidence, leaving only obedience. She did not need to speak. In this house, words were often unnecessary. The power she held was silent, invisible, and relentless. Later, Samuel joined the other men in the yard. They spoke softly, cautiously, exchanging glances instead of words. Even laughter was rare. To let go of control for a moment could draw attention, and attention meant scrutiny. They had all learned the same lesson. Clarabelle's gaze was everywhere, and no one could escape it. One man whispered to Samuel, "She watches more than she speaks. That's the worst part. You never know what you're being judged for." Samuel nodded, understanding exactly what was meant. The fear was not of work or of punishment. It was of being measured, assessed, and found wanting in a way that left no visible scars but etched something deeper into the soul. As the sun sank low, casting long shadows across the fields, Samuel returned to the house to help with evening chores. The air cooled, but the tension remained. The candlelight flickered against the polished floors, and in every reflection he caught, he saw not only himself, but the memory of every man who had stood before Clarabelle's eyes, silent, measured, and controlled. That night, as he lay on the straw mattress in the corner of the servants' quarters, Samuel stared at the ceiling and listened to the house breathe. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the distant echoes of life on the fields. Inside, he could feel the pulse of the mansion, alive with memory and command. He thought of all the men who had come before him, all the lessons they had learned in silence, and he felt a strange mixture of fear, anger, and endurance. He would survive, he told himself. He had to. But the weight of Clarabelle's gaze, the weight of the house, and the weight of being measured every day would stay with him. It would not fade with sleep, with freedom, or with the passing years. It was a silent burden, carried in the chest, the spine, the mind, a weight that no man could lift alone. And so the plantation settled into the darkness, the wind moving like a whisper through the sugarcane, carrying the unspoken stories of those who served, endured, and survived. Samuel closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same work, the same gaze, and the same impossible silence. But he also knew that he had learned something essential. Survival was not just in the body, it was in the mind, the heart, and the quiet defiance that no one could see. The night deepened, shadows stretched across the walls, and somewhere in the mansion, Clarabelle watched, waited, and measured. The granny of shadows was never far from the thoughts of those who lived under her eyes, and her influence stretched beyond words, beyond fear, into every careful step they took.
The mornings in the mansion began quietly, almost deceptively. To anyone passing by, the house was a picture of calm. Servants bustling softly, dishes clinking in the kitchen, the occasional laughter of children in the distance. But inside, there was a different rhythm, one that pulsed with the constant presence of Clarabelle's gaze. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, were everywhere, even when she was not physically in the room. Samuel knew this better than anyone. Every motion he made, every breath was measured against the invisible scale of her attention. There were no lashings here, no visible punishments, yet the fear was constant, sharp enough to cut through sleep and daylight alike. The most terrifying lesson he had learned on the plantation was that Clarabelle could control a man without touching him. She did it with a look, a pause, a tilt of her head, and once she had measured him, nothing could undo it. It was in the private rooms that her power was most visible. Samuel remembered the first time he had been summoned there alone. He had entered quietly, carrying a tray of water, his eyes lowered as always. Clarabelle sat in her favorite chair, her posture relaxed, as though she were only reading a book. But he had quickly realized that the book was a mask. Her eyes flicked up, scanning him from head to toe. Every movement was noted, every twitch of a finger, every breath that came too fast or too slow. "Stand here," she said softly, pointing to a spot in the center of the room. He obeyed immediately, his heart hammering in his chest. There was no malice in her tone, at least not the kind he had heard from overseers or men with whips, but it was infinitely more frightening. It carried the weight of law, the expectation of obedience, and the power to wound deeply without leaving a mark. The room was quiet, except for the soft tick of a clock, and Samuel could hear nothing but his own breathing. Clarabelle circled him slowly, her eyes never leaving his form. "Hold still," she whispered. Not a command, really, not aloud, but in the way she moved, the way she measured, it became impossible to ignore. Samuel felt exposed, reduced to his body, his posture, his very presence. The fear in that room was a tangible thing, pressing on his shoulders, crawling into his spine. This was not curiosity. This was control. This was Clarabelle transforming the invisible power of her position into a force that could shape a man's mind, bending him to her will with nothing more than observation. Every man who had passed through those rooms carried the memory of being measured and found wanting, of having their dignity stripped away in silence. Samuel remembered how the other men spoke quietly among themselves, in whispers that carried no names. They never said the words aloud, for to do so was dangerous. Instead, they shared knowing glances, small signs of understanding, and a shared fear that bound them together. Clarabelle's influence stretched further than her own body, extending into every corner of the house, every shadow, every mirror. The memory of her gaze lingered, haunting them long after they left the room. It was not just Samuel who suffered under this quiet tyranny. Younger men brought from the fields to serve in the house felt it as well. Some were new, unaccustomed to the unspoken rules, and they trembled under her eyes, trying to guess what she wanted without daring to speak. Others were older, seasoned by experience, but the fear never left them fully. They carried it quietly, like a wound that would not heal. Clarabelle herself seemed to understand this power better than anyone else. She moved through the mansion with the poise of a queen, never raising her voice, never issuing unnecessary orders. Yet she had a way of orchestrating obedience that left no evidence of coercion. The men became instruments of her will, performing silently, learning the rules of fear and compliance without instruction. Every glance, every hesitation, every sigh was noticed, interpreted, and recorded in her memory. Samuel often wondered why she did it. It was not desire in the ordinary sense. It was something darker, a perverse pleasure in control. She did not need love or affection. She needed to assert her dominance, to remind the men, and perhaps herself, that her authority was absolute. When her husband had died, she had lost one form of power, but this became a new one. The house became her kingdom, the men her subjects, and her gaze the law that no one dared to question. The psychological weight of this domination was immense. Samuel felt it in his chest, in the tightness of his shoulders, in the way his hands shook even when no one else was present. It was a lesson in invisibility, in being objectified without recourse. He learned to anticipate her attention, to move and breathe in ways that would satisfy her scrutiny. Every day was a test, and every night was filled with memory, the fear, the humiliation, and the knowledge that one wrong move could earn her attention in the worst way. Yet in that fear, Samuel discovered a kind of endurance. He learned to stand still, to endure the scrutiny, to survive without showing weakness. It was a survival not of the body, but of the mind. The house, the shadows, and Clarabelle's gaze taught him a difficult truth. Freedom could be stolen from a man while he remained alive. It could live in the eyes of another, in the quiet observation that left no mark, but cut deeply all the same.
By evening, the sun had dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the polished floors and velvet curtains. Samuel returned to the quarters, silent as always, and joined the other men in their shared space. They spoke cautiously, their voices low, but their eyes carried stories that could not be spoken. Each man bore his own memory of Clarabelle's scrutiny, each step of daily life colored by the shadow of her presence. Samuel sat on the edge of his straw mattress, staring at the darkened ceiling. He thought of the room, of the gaze that measured him, of the invisible lines of power that had been drawn around him since he first arrived on the plantation. He understood now that Clarabelle's cruelty was not loud or violent. It was quiet, intimate, and inescapable. It taught lessons that left no scars on the skin, but carved deep marks on the soul. The wind moved through the sugarcane outside, carrying whispers of life and freedom that felt distant and impossible. Inside, the house seemed to breathe, alive with memory and control. Samuel closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same work, the same scrutiny, the same invisible chains. Yet he also knew something else. Survival required endurance, strength, and the quiet rebellion of keeping one's mind and dignity intact even when the body was forced to obey. Clarabelle, the granny of shadows, remained in her chambers, her presence a silent ruler over every thought, every movement, and every fear. And in her shadow, the men of the plantation learned the cruelest lesson of all. Power could exist without force, and domination could thrive in silence.
Years passed, and the mansion continued its quiet dominion over the lives within its walls. Miss Clarabelle, the granny of shadows, moved through the rooms with the same calculated grace, measuring, observing, and shaping the men who served her. But her influence did not end with the enslaved. It reached further, into the hearts and minds of the women around her, her daughters, her granddaughters, and even distant relatives who spent time in the house. Clarabelle had taught them many things, not lessons of kindness or compassion, but lessons of control, power, and authority. The daughters watched her carefully, seeing the way she commanded obedience without raising her voice, the way she could reduce a man to silence with just a glance. They learned to mimic her gestures, to measure the men who served them in the same way, to assert dominance subtly, invisibly, but unmistakably. Elijah, a boy of 10 at the time, often accompanied his mother and sisters when they visited the mansion. He was a quiet child, observant, noticing details that others might dismiss. On one visit, he stood in the corner of a hall, watching as Clarabelle's granddaughter, a girl not yet 16, followed the older woman's example. She summoned a young man to serve tea, her voice polite but firm, her eyes scanning him as if she could weigh his very soul. The man moved carefully, step by step, unsure of what would please her or earn her displeasure. Elijah felt a chill as he realized that this was more than simple authority, it was ritualized control. Clarabelle noticed Elijah standing in the shadows and smiled faintly. Not a smile of warmth, but a knowing one, as if she recognized that he was beginning to understand the rules of her world. He did not speak. He did not need to. The lessons were being taught silently, without words. Observing, he learned what survival meant, even for those who would never be enslaved in the same way he had seen. The house itself seemed to participate in this education. The polished floors reflected the light of the candles. The portraits of ancestors lining the walls bore witness to the unspoken lessons, and the air carried a weight that pressed on all who entered. For the young women, it was a lesson in power. For the men, it was a reminder of their place. And for Elijah, it was a quiet revelation of how cruelty could be taught, repeated, and even admired under the guise of refinement. The younger women were not merely mimicking Clarabelle. They were learning to see the world as she did. To them, it was not cruelty. It was culture, sophistication, even tradition. They did not yet understand the psychological scars they were inflicting, nor did they know the depths of fear they inspired. To them, the men were objects, tools, instruments of power that could be measured and shaped. They learned that authority could exist without open violence, that fear could be instilled silently, and that the eyes of the powerful could control more effectively than hands ever could. Elijah watched, absorbing everything. He saw how the young woman moved through the house, how they summoned and dismissed the men with quiet gestures, and how each man carried himself with the weight of invisible chains. He noticed the small hesitations, the subtle signs of tension, the careful obedience that spoke louder than words. Even as a child, he understood that power could be subtle, pervasive, and dangerous. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the lace curtains, Elijah observed Clarabelle herself instructing a young woman in the proper way to summon a man to stand silently while she assessed him. "Watch his eyes," Clarabelle whispered, her tone soft but absolute. "See if he trembles. See if he hesitates. That is the truth of him." The young girl nodded, wide-eyed, and practiced the same method with a servant who brought a tray of food. Elijah felt a chill run through him. Even at his age, he recognized that this was more than simply a game. It was the continuation of a system of control passed down quietly from generation to generation. The house, with its gleaming floors and polished chandeliers, seemed to hum with memory. The shadows clung to corners. The air felt dense with authority, and the men who moved through the house bore the marks of invisible chains. Elijah noticed their silent endurance, their careful movements, and the subtle signs of fear that spoke volumes. He learned that the legacy of power was not only in the hands of the one who held it, but in the minds of those who observed and repeated it. At night, when the household settled into quiet and candlelit flickered against the walls, Elijah lay awake in the guest room thinking of what he had seen. He could still feel the eyes on him, the weight of observation that he had witnessed, and the subtle ways cruelty could be disguised as authority. Clarabelle's lessons were everywhere, not in words, but in actions, gestures, and silent commands. Even her absence in a room did not lessen the power she wielded. The shadow of her influence stretched far beyond the physical limits of her body. The Granny of Shadows had left her mark on the next generation. The daughters and granddaughters carried it forward, often without knowing the full scope of what they were replicating. Elijah understood that power once learned could be repeated in ways both visible and invisible. He felt the early weight of history pressing upon him, and he realized that surviving the present required not only strength of body, but strength of mind. And so the mansion continued its quiet lessons. The men endured, the young women absorbed, and Elijah absorbed it all, a witness to the subtle cruelty that flourished behind the polished doors. Clarabelle's legacy was not just in what she commanded, but in what she had taught others to replicate long after her own hands could no longer enforce it. The rituals of dominance, the measured glances, the silent assessments all became part of the house's fabric, a woven history of fear and control that no one dared to speak of aloud. The sun set over the plantation, casting long, dark shadows across the fields and the house. Inside, the air felt heavy, carrying the unspoken lessons of years, the whispers of those who had endured, and the careful observation of those who had learned to wield authority. Elijah closed his eyes that night, holding in his chest the knowledge of what he had seen. He could not act yet, could not challenge what he had witnessed, But he understood that the legacy of power would not fade easily. It would follow, quietly, into the next generation, shaping minds and hearts in ways both subtle and permanent. And somewhere in the mansion, Clarabelle sat in her favorite chair, her eyes sharp even in memory, teaching those who watched her how to hold dominion without ever tucking, how to instill fear without words, and how the shadow of power could stretch farther and last longer than any chains ever could.
The war had begun. Cannons thundered in distant cities, and the air across the south trembled with the promise of change. Samuel, now a young man in his 20s, had heard the rumors for months, talk of rebellion, of emancipation, of a world where chains could no longer hold a man. The word freedom passed through the fields like wildfire, whispered carefully from one man to another. Yet even as it grew louder, Samuel felt a strange, uneasy weight in his chest. Freedom, he realized, was not the undoing of fear. It was not a simple unchaining of the body. It was a challenge to the mind, to years of lessons imposed in silence and shadows. The whip of Clarabelle, the granny of shadows, was gone, but the scars she had left in the minds of those she dominated were not so easily erased. The plantation lay quiet that morning, the sky gray with smoke from distant battles. Samuel moved through the sugarcane, carrying a basket of tools, though no overseer commanded him. The men around him whispered about the Union soldiers advancing, about the promise of a new world. Yet even in this hope, they carried memories heavier than any sack of sugarcane. The fear of eyes that measured, the humiliation of being assessed in silence, the invisible chains of power that no war could undo. Samuel remembered every encounter in the private rooms, every glance from Clarabelle that had left him trembling, every command that had forced him to obey without question. That fear had been real. It had shaped him, bent him, and forced him to endure. Now, with the war approaching and the possibility of freedom near, he felt both exhilaration and dread. To be free meant more than leaving the plantation. It meant confronting a world that had never recognized his humanity, a world that might still fail to see him as more than property or shadow. When the day came that the Union soldiers finally entered the plantation, the fields were quiet but tense. Samuel and the other men watched from a distance, their hearts pounding as they saw the soldiers move through the property. The mansion stood untouched, but the air inside it felt different, as though some invisible weight had shifted. For the first time in decades, the men could move without immediate scrutiny, without the constant pressure of eyes measuring every step. Yet the ghosts of the past did not leave so easily. Samuel found himself stepping lightly, careful not to draw attention, a habit ingrained over years of service. Even as the soldier spoke words of freedom, he felt the residue of Clarabelle's gaze, the lesson she had taught him that obedience was safer than defiance, that silence was protection, that survival required careful calculation. In the following weeks, the former enslaved men began to leave the plantation. Some returned to their families, others sought new lives in towns or farms, trying to build something that had never been allowed before. Independence, dignity, a chance to exist without constant observation. But even as they walked away, the psychological weight lingered. Samuel noticed it most in the quiet moments, when he slept, when he sat alone by a fire, when he spoke with his friends. The memory of being measured, controlled, and reduced to an object of scrutiny haunted him like a shadow. Elijah, who had grown up into a young man himself, returned to the ruins of Clarabelle's mansion after the war. The house had survived, but it was hollowed out, the floors creaking, the walls covered in dust and decay. Yet as he stepped inside, he felt it, the invisible presence of the Granny of Shadows, as if the mansion itself remembered her. He could almost see her in the corner, measuring, observing, asserting control, even though she was long gone. He walked through the rooms carefully, remembering the rituals he had witnessed as a child, the silent summoning of men, the calculated assessment, the quiet enforcement of dominance. That memory made his chest tighten. The Civil War had freed bodies, but the lessons, the psychological scars, the imprint of fear and humiliation remained. Freedom was not a switch, it was a process, a slow unlearning of terror that had been instilled from birth or from the moment one stepped onto the plantation grounds. Samuel and Elijah met one evening, sitting together beneath the open sky. The war had left its marks, but the plantation's shadows remained in their minds. Samuel spoke softly, almost reluctantly. "They took more than work from us," he said, looking at the stars. "They took the part that makes you stand tall. And even now I feel the weight of it." Elijah nodded. He understood exactly what was meant. The power of the Granny of Shadows was not in chains or whips, but in control, observation, and ritualized dominance. It was a force that shaped behavior, bent minds, and instilled obedience without the need for physical punishment. And that force, once learned, did not vanish with emancipation. It lived on in memory, in caution, in the way men held themselves, in the fear they could not shake. The next day, Samuel and others began the slow work of reclaiming their lives. They built homes, planted gardens, and sought work that offered real wages for real labor. They sang songs in the evenings, shared stories of their families, and celebrated their freedom. Yet under the surface, the lessons of the past continued to echo. In every glance, in every gesture, they carried the imprint of years under Clarabelle's invisible authority. The plantation itself, though empty of enslaved men, remained a symbol of the old world. Its polished floors, once gleaming under candlelight, were now cracked and dusty. The gardens, once meticulously maintained, were overgrown with weeds. The mansion was a relic, but the lessons it had enforced were not so easily left behind. For Samuel, Elijah, and the others, freedom was a beginning, not a conclusion. They had escaped chains, but they had not escaped memory. At night, under the vast southern sky, Samuel lay awake thinking of Clarabelle, of the Granny of Shadows, and of all the men who had come before him. He felt sorrow for the lives reduced, for the dignity stolen, for the lessons taught in silence. And yet, he felt a quiet pride too. He had endured. He had survived. And though the shadows of the past lingered, he carried with him the knowledge that survival was not only physical, it was mental, emotional, and moral. Freedom had arrived, but its ghosts followed. The past could not be erased, only remembered, honored, and survived. And in that quiet understanding, Samuel, Elijah, and the others began to walk forward, carrying with them the weight of what they had endured, the lessons of cruelty learned and unlearned, and the hope that the next generations might live without the same shadows watching over them. The plantation had fallen into silence. Its fields, once alive with labor and whispers, were now empty, the sugarcane overgrown and swaying in the wind. The mansion loomed like a hollow monument, its polished floors cracked, its velvet curtains faded, and the chandeliers coated in dust. Yet even in decay, the house held a strange life of its own, a memory of every glance, every command, every shadow that had once moved through its halls. Elijah returned to the ruins, older now, carrying with him the stories of Samuel and the other men who had endured Clarabelle's rule. He had come to show his own children the place where history had lived, where cruelty had walked alongside refinement, and where silence had been the law. The young ones followed cautiously, eyes wide at the crumbling walls, the broken furniture, and the scent of time itself, molded wood, earth, and the faint trace of sweat and fear that seemed to cling to every corner. "This is where it happened," Elijah said softly, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "The Granny of Shadows, Miss Clarabelle, she ruled here, not with chains or whips, but with her eyes, her commands, and the fear she could instill without raising a hand. She measured every man who served her. She made them live in silence, and even now the walls remember." The children listened in hushed awe, sensing something beyond what words could capture. The air felt heavy, charged with history, and the shadows in the corners seemed to shift, as if carrying the echoes of those long gone. Elijah led them through the main hall, stopping by the private rooms where the men had been summoned. "These rooms," he said, were where dignity was taken, where fear was taught, where silence became a form of control. No one spoke about it openly, but the pain lived here. He paused at a cracked mirror, its surface dim and clouded. Samuel's memory flickered in his mind, the trembling hands, the lowered eyes, the invisible chains of Clarabelle's gaze. The children stared at the glass, sensing the weight it carried. They could not see the events themselves, but they felt the history embedded in the walls, the floors, and the lingering echoes of footsteps that had once moved with caution and fear. Elijah told them of Samuel, the man who had endured it all, and how he had survived. He carried the memory quietly, he said. He never spoke of every detail, because words could never capture it. But he taught us something essential. Survival is not just physical. It is in the mind, the heart, and the way you hold yourself when the world tries to reduce you. The children asked questions, timid at first, then with growing curiosity. "Did she hurt them?" one asked. Elijah shook his head slowly. "Not with chains or whips. Her cruelty was quieter. It was psychological. She made them stand, made them obey, made them feel less than human while she watched. That is why it is so important to remember. Power can hurt in ways that leave no scars on the skin, only on the soul." As they moved through the hallways, Elijah pointed to small details, the scuffed floors, the faint stains on the walls, the remnants of furniture that had been moved too many times. Each object carried a memory, each creak of the wood a whisper from the past. He told them that the legacy of Clarabelle was not just in physical fear, but in the lessons that had been passed down to her daughters and granddaughters, that authority could be silent, invisible, and absolute. The children shivered as they walked into the private quarters. The air was cooler here, heavier, and Elijah felt the memories press against him, as though the walls themselves were holding him in their grasp. "These rooms," he said, "were where men were summoned to stand silently, to endure her gaze, to learn obedience without question. And the thing is, the world did not see it. The law did not see it. The church did not see it. Only the men lived it, and only they carried it forward in silence." One of his children asked quietly, "Was she evil?" Elijah paused, choosing his words. Evil is a word that is too simple for what happened here. She was a product of a system that allowed cruelty to be hidden behind wealth, culture, and authority. But yes, she chose to use that power to hurt others, even if it was invisible. And the harm she caused lasted long after she was gone. They lingered in the room, feeling the weight of history. Elijah told them that this was why memory mattered, why stories mattered, why survivors carried truths that the world often ignored. The horrors of the house were not just in the past, they were lessons for understanding power, control, and the subtle ways cruelty can exist in the world even when no one raises a hand. As they left the mansion, stepping into the overgrown gardens, Elijah looked back at the house. Its walls were crumbling, its grandeur faded, but the memory of what had occurred inside remained. He understood that history did not vanish with destruction. It adapted, survived, and found ways to imprint itself on those who endured it. The children walked behind him in silence, absorbing the gravity of what they had witnessed. Elijah felt a mixture of sorrow and resolve. The past was heavy, but it also carried lessons that could guide them. They could choose to remember, to acknowledge, and to act differently than those who had come before. They could learn that power unchecked could corrupt, that dominance could hide behind elegance, and that survival sometimes meant endurance, awareness, and quiet resistance. That night, as Elijah sat by the fire, he thought of Samuel and the countless men who had carried these memories without a voice. He thought of Clarabelle, her daughters, and the invisible chains she had imposed. He understood that the ruins of the mansion were more than broken walls. They were the echoes of power, the imprint of fear, and the silent testament of resilience. The plantation would never be alive again, but its shadows lingered, teaching the next generation that history is not just what is written in books or celebrated in monuments. It is what is remembered, carried quietly, and passed forward. Elijah closed his eyes, knowing that though the ghost of the shadows was gone, her lessons remained, and that it was up to those who remembered to confront them, understand them, and ensure that the ghosts of the past did not continue to dictate the present.
The South had changed, but not entirely. The plantations, once centers of wealth and cruelty, had been burned, abandoned, or transformed into farms. The Civil War had ended chains and forced obedience, yet the shadows of the past lingered, stretching far beyond the ruined walls and empty fields. Some scars were visible, others invisible, etched into the minds, hearts, and bodies of those who had endured, and into the culture that had created them. Elijah, now an older man, often thought about Samuel and the countless men who had survived the Granny of Shadows. He thought about the lessons they had carried, that cruelty could exist without force, that dominance could be silent, and that survival sometimes required endurance, not confrontation. These lessons were not just historical, they were personal. They shaped how he lived, how he taught his children, and how he remembered the past. The house where Clarabelle had ruled was long gone to decay, yet Elijah could still feel its presence in the wind through the trees, in the rustling of cane, and in the shadows that clung to the earth. The memory of her eyes, her calculated assessments, and her silent power was like an echo that refused to fade. The lessons she had imparted, whether intentionally or not, had become part of the culture, passed from one generation to the next, not always with recognition, sometimes with subtle imitation. Elijah's granddaughter, a young woman of 20, listened carefully as he spoke of the past. He told her about Clarabelle, about Samuel, about the countless men who endured silent domination in private rooms, and about how power, once unchecked, could warp even those who appeared gentle or refined. Her eyes widened, absorbing every detail, understanding the gravity of the stories not as folklore, but as truth. "The world must remember," Elijah said, his voice firm. "We cannot let the silence continue. The cruelty was not always obvious. It was hidden in the gaze, in the quiet, in the way the powerful use their authority without consequence. That is the part that lasts." The granddaughter nodded. She had heard stories of slavery before, tales of chains, whips, and markets, but what Elijah described was different. It was quieter, more insidious, harder to prove, and harder to confront. It was the cruelty that did not leave bruises, but left memories. It was the lesson in power that the Granny of Shadows had mastered and passed down in subtle ways to her daughters, her granddaughters, and to the culture itself. Elijah guided her to the old family records, letters, and estate papers that had survived the years. In the margins, faint notes hinted at practices that were never meant to be documented. Summoned men, silent assessments, rules of obedience passed down through generations of women who had learned from Clarabelle. They were fragments of memory, carefully hidden, yet powerful in what they revealed. History, he told her, often overlooks these acts because they leave no physical evidence. But the truth survives in the stories, in the memory of the survivors, and in the quiet courage of those willing to bear witness. The granddaughter understood. She saw how the legacy of the Granny of Shadows had not ended with emancipation. It had adapted, transformed into subtle forms of control, social expectation, and cultural hierarchy. The house was gone, but the lessons remained. The power of observation, the authority of the elite, and the objectification of those deemed less powerful still existed in new clothes, in new systems, and in behaviors that went unquestioned. Elijah looked out at the fields where the sugarcane had once grown. Children now played among the remnants of fences and walls. Farmers tended crops without the weight of overseers. Yet in the quiet, Elijah could sense the echoes of the past, teaching vigilance, awareness, and endurance. He understood that memory and the courage to confront it was a form of freedom just as important as emancipation. He told his granddaughter about Samuel one last time, about the quiet dignity he had carried through life, and about how he survived not by resisting with fists, but by holding his mind and spirit intact. Samuel had walked away from chains, but he had carried the memories of the Granny of Shadows, and in doing so had learned what freedom truly demanded: resilience, awareness, and a refusal to let the past define the present entirely. "Power doesn't vanish," Elijah said, his voice steady. "It changes shape. It hides behind wealth, behind politeness, behind culture, even behind religion. The Granny of Shadows may be gone, but her lessons, her cruelty, are still alive if we do not acknowledge them. That is why you must remember. That is why you must teach others." The granddaughter nodded again, a quiet determination settling in her heart. She felt the weight of history, but also the responsibility that came with it. Memory was a weapon, a guide, and a shield. The stories of those who endured silence, humiliation, and invisible domination were not just about suffering. They were about survival, courage, and the human spirit's refusal to be fully owned. As night fell, Elijah walked outside, gazing at the stars. He could almost hear the whispers of the men who endured, the soft echoes of chains replaced by the weight of memory. Clarabelle's mansion was gone, but the lessons she had imparted, however dark, persisted in the lives she had touched and the culture she had shaped. And yet, in this persistence, there was hope. The next generations could see clearly, learn and confront the shadows of the past. They could recognize cruelty where it hides, refuse to normalize dominance, and ensure that survival was not only possible, but meaningful. The echoes of the Granny of Shadows, Samuel, and the countless others were no longer merely reminders of pain, but guides for resilience, courage, and understanding. Elijah closed his eyes, feeling the weight of all he had witnessed, endured, and remembered. He thought of the men who survived, of the women who perpetuated cruelty, and of the world that had overlooked it all. But he also thought of the new generations, the listeners, the witnesses, the ones who carried memory forward with courage. The past was not gone, its echoes remained, but now, at last, they could be understood, confronted, and remembered with truth. The wind moved through the overgrown fields, carrying with it the whispers of history, survival, and resilience. The ghosts of the past were no longer invisible. They were present in stories, in memory, and in the courage of those willing to look, listen, and learn.
And in that quiet understanding, Elijah smiled. Freedom had arrived, chains had fallen, but the greatest legacy was not just survival. It was the unbroken transmission of memory, the courage to face power without fear, and the knowledge that even shadows, once exposed, could teach the living how to endure and prevail.